When Daniel Marsh died in the spring of 1963, his parents gave his widow 1 week to leave the house. No money, no explanation, no help of any kind. Just a single iron key pressed into her hand at the door, old, heavy, and rusted at the edges. Patricia Marsh said it opened an abandoned chapel at the edge of the family land. She said Daniel had always meant for Emma to have it. She didn't say why, she didn't say what was inside. Emma was 26 years old. She had an 8-week-old baby, 4 pounds to her name, and nowhere to go in a village where nobody offered to help. She walked across a frozen field alone, put the key in the lock, and pushed the door open. What she found inside that chapel had been sitting in the dark for over 20 years, and it would change everything. Emma Marsh had moved to the village of Ashford Beck 3 years earlier when she married Daniel. She had no family there, no history, no roots. Everything she had built in that place had been built around him. Daniel was a quiet man, a farmer's son who had taken over a small parcel of land from his father and worked it without complaint. He didn't talk much, but he was steady and kind in the way that mattered, the kind of man who noticed when something was wrong before you said anything. He died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in April. He was 31 years old. The doctor said it was rare but not unheard of. The neighbours said what a tragedy. Gerald and Patricia Marsh said very little at the funeral and invited Emma to the house afterward for tea, which she attended with Iris sleeping against her chest, not yet understanding that the conversation waiting for her at that table would be the last one held in her interests. Gerald explained it simply. The house, the land, the farm. All of it had been in the Marsh name for 3 generations. Daniel had never formally transferred anything to Emma's name. Without that, the law was clear, and Gerald intended to follow it. Emma asked what she was supposed to do. Gerald said that was not really his concern. The key had belonged to Daniel's grandfather, Robert Marsh. Patricia explained this briefly, without much interest, as if she were describing something found at the back of a drawer. The Marsh family had been one of the oldest in the valley. In the mid-1800s, when the family owned considerably more land than they did now, Robert's father had commissioned a small private chapel to be built at the edge of the property. This was not unusual for families of that standing in rural Yorkshire at the time. A private place of worship separate from the village church was considered both practical and a mark of a certain kind of respectability. The chapel had been used for family services, christenings and burials for several decades. By the time Robert inherited the land, the family's circumstances had changed. Much of the land had been sold off. The private chapel had fallen out of regular use. Robert locked it sometime in the late 1930s and never opened it again. He died in 1943 and left no instructions about it. Gerald had inherited the key along with everything else, and had never used it. Daniel had asked about it once as a boy. Gerald had told him it was nothing worth thinking about. Daniel had apparently thought about it anyway, because sometime before he died, he had written Emma's name on a small envelope, placed the key inside, and left it with his personal papers with a note that said only, "Give this to Emma." Gerald handed it to her at the table without ceremony. He said he was honouring Daniel's instruction. He did not say he understood it. What neither of them said, not directly, not that afternoon, was something Emma had felt since the day Daniel died. Gerald and Patricia had never fully accepted her. She had come from outside the valley, from a family they considered ordinary, and they had always believed, privately and sometimes not so privately, that Daniel had married beneath himself. When he died at 31 from a heart that simply stopped, they needed somewhere to put that grief. Emma was available. They looked at Iris the way people look at something that reminds them of a wound. She had Daniel's eyes and Daniel's mouth, and she was 8 weeks old and had done nothing to anyone. But she was also Emma's daughter, and that complicated everything for them in ways they couldn't untangle and didn't try to. They did not offer to help with the baby. They did not ask to hold her. When Emma stood to leave, Patricia looked at Iris once, briefly, the way you glance at something you're trying not to see, and then looked away. Emma was halfway across the yard when Patricia called after her. She turned. Patricia said, "The chapel is yours to do with as you like. We want nothing to do with it." Then she went back inside and closed the door. Emma stood in the April cold with a baby on her chest and a key in her pocket, and understood, clearly and without self-pity, that she was entirely on her own. Emma was halfway down the lane when she heard her name. Mrs. Alderton was standing at her garden gate, a widow of 60 who had lived on that lane since before Emma was born. She'd watched Emma leave the Marsh house with a bag over one shoulder and a baby on her chest, and had put the kettle on before Emma had reached the end of the path. She didn't ask questions. She sat Emma down, gave her tea and 2 slices of bread with butter, and disappeared into the pantry. She came back with a wrapped parcel, a loaf, some cheese, a tin of sardines, and 4 eggs carefully packed in a cloth. She pressed it into Emma's hands and said, "You'll need to eat to feed that baby." Then she hesitated. She looked at Iris for a moment, 8 weeks old, asleep against Emma's chest, and said she had a small storage room at the back of the house. Not much, a cot and oil heater that still worked, no window. But it was dry and it was warm, and Emma was welcome to it for a few nights until she'd worked out what to do. She said it quietly, as if offering too much might embarrass them both. Emma accepted without hesitation. She stayed 3 nights. On the 4th morning, Mrs. Alderton told her gently that her son was coming to stay and she needed the room. She was sorry. She meant it. Emma thanked her, picked up her bag, and walked across the frozen field toward the chapel. The chapel was smaller than she had imagined. Stone walls darkened with damp, a slate roof collapsed on one side, 4 narrow windows thick with grime. The yew trees around it blocked most of the light even at midday. The iron key turned stiffly. The door swung open. Inside, cold air, dead leaves against the far wall, a stone floor intact beneath the debris. The pews were gone, the altar was bare, but in the corner, stacked carefully against the driest wall and wrapped in oilcloth, were paintings. 9 of them, leaning in the dark as if someone had set them down and simply never come back. Beside them, a large wooden chest, the latch rusted but intact. Emma stood in the doorway with Iris on her chest and said nothing for a long moment. Then she stepped inside. She blocked the broken window with a board she found leaning against the outside wall, gathered the dead leaves into a pile away from where she would sleep, and laid the blanket Mrs. Alderton had given her on the driest section of floor. She settled Iris down, kept her coat on, and sat with her back against the wall. She didn't touch the paintings that night. She had a child to keep warm and a roof to assess, but she didn't sleep much either. She unwrapped the first painting in the morning light, a landscape. Dark moorland under a heavy sky, a farmhouse in the distance, the brushwork loose and confident, a signature in the bottom corner she didn't recognise. The second was a portrait of a woman in early Victorian dress, formal and still, her eyes following the viewer in the way old portraits sometimes do. The third was smaller, a study of light on water, almost abstract. She didn't know what any of them were worth. She had never owned anything valuable in her life, but even she could see that these were not amateur works. The oilcloth had protected them well. The colours were intact, the canvas firm, no visible damage. She counted them, 9 in total. She opened the wooden chest. Inside, documents. Purchase records, handwritten in neat, careful script, each painting listed with a date, a price, and a name. The earliest was dated 1931, the last 1939. Daniel's grandfather Robert had bought all 9, every transaction documented, every seller named. Emma sat on the cold stone floor with Iris asleep beside her and read through every page. Getting the paintings valued was not simple. Emma had no telephone. The nearest auction house was in York, 50 miles away. She had no car, no money for the bus fare, and no one to leave Iris with if she managed either. She walked back to the village the next morning with Iris on her chest and knocked on Mrs. Alderton's door. She didn't ask for money or a place to stay. She asked if she knew anyone with a vehicle going anywhere near York. Mrs. Alderton thought for a moment. Her son was coming at the weekend. He had a van. She couldn't promise anything, but she would ask. He came on Saturday, grumbling about the petrol. Emma sat in the back with Iris and the smallest painting wrapped in brown paper on her lap. She had chosen the study of light on water, small enough to carry easily, old enough to be taken seriously. The man at the auction house in York unwrapped it slowly. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he asked where she had gotten it. She told him. He asked if there were more. She said there were 8 others. He set the painting down and looked at her over his glasses, with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. The auctioneer's name was Mr. Hepworth. He had been in the business for 30 years and was not a man given to excitement. But he asked Emma to wait, disappeared into a back room, and returned 20 minutes later with a colleague and a magnifying glass. They spoke quietly to each other for a while. Emma sat on a wooden chair with Iris on her lap and said nothing. Mr. Hepworth finally turned to her. The painting, he said, was almost certainly the work of a minor but documented Yorkshire landscape artist from the 1880s. Not a household name, but genuine, well-preserved, and sellable. He valued it at between £60 and £90. Emma kept her expression steady. He said if the other 8 were of similar quality and provenance, and if the purchase records were as clean as she described, the full collection could be worth somewhere between £400 and £800. Emma thanked him, wrapped the painting back in its brown paper, and asked him to write the valuation down on a letterhead. She had a feeling she was going to need it in writing. She didn't sell anything immediately. Back in the chapel, she sat with the documents from the chest and read through them again carefully. The purchase records were clean. Every painting bought legally, every transaction dated and signed. Robert Marsh had been methodical about it. What she needed now was to confirm that the paintings were legally hers to sell. The key had been given to her by Patricia herself. The chapel sat on land left separately from the main Marsh estate. But Emma was a young woman with no legal experience in 1963 rural Yorkshire, and she knew that without someone to confirm it in writing, Gerald Marsh could make her life very difficult if he chose to. She wrote a letter to a solicitor in the nearest market town, a Mr. Calloway. She had found his name on a notice board outside the post office. She explained the situation plainly and asked for an appointment. He wrote back within the week. She walked 4 miles to his office with Iris in her arms. He read the documents she brought, asked several careful questions, and told her that, as far as he could determine, the contents of the chapel were hers. The key had been transferred to her directly. The purchase records named the paintings as Robert Marsh's personal property. Distinct from the family estate, Gerald had no claim. He paused, then added, "I would move quickly before anyone thinks to dispute it." She had been back from Mr. Calloway's office for less than a week when Gerald appeared at the chapel door. She heard him before she saw him. Heavy footsteps on the stone path, the sound of someone who wasn't used to being kept waiting. Emma was feeding Iris when he filled the doorway, looking at the space around him with an expression she recognised. The same one he had worn at the table the day he told her to leave. He didn't greet her. He looked at the bare walls, the empty corner where the chest had been, and then at her. "Where are the paintings?" he said. It wasn't a question. Emma kept her voice steady. She told him they were being assessed. She told him she had documentation for everything. She told him she'd spoken to a solicitor. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. He said the contents of that chapel had been Marsh family property for decades. He said Daniel had no right to give away what wasn't his to give. He said he intended to look into the matter. Emma said, "Please do. Mr. Calloway's expecting to hear from you." Gerald left without another word. 2 weeks later, Mr. Calloway received a letter from a solicitor in Harrogate acting on Gerald's behalf, questioning the validity of the key transfer and the ownership of the chapel contents. Mr. Calloway replied with a detailed response citing the land registry records, the separate designation of the chapel in Robert Marsh's estate, and the documented transfer of the key directly to Emma by Patricia Marsh in the presence of witnesses. He heard nothing further. He told Emma afterward that in his experience, when the other side goes quiet that quickly, it usually means they consulted someone who told them the truth. Emma filed the letter in the wooden chest along with everything else. The first painting sold in September 1963 for £72. Emma stood at the counter of Mr. Hepworth's auction house and held the envelope for a moment before opening it. It was more money than she had seen at one time in her life. She paid Mr. Calloway his fee. She rented 2 rooms above the bakery in the village, small, cold in winter, but hers. She bought a proper crib for Iris, a pair of boots that didn't let in water, and enough coal to last through October. She told nobody where the money had come from. In a village that size, she knew that word would reach Gerald and Patricia before the week was out. Mr. Calloway had said she was within her rights. She believed him, but she also knew that being right and being left alone were not always the same thing. She sold a second painting in November, a third in the spring of 1964. Gerald never contacted her again. Patricia never contacted her again. Whether they knew what was in the chapel and had simply calculated it wasn't worth the trouble, or whether they genuinely had no idea what Robert had stored there all those years ago, Emma never found out. She didn't go looking for the answer. She had Iris to feed and rent to pay and a life to build from the ground up, and that was enough to be getting on with. By 1965, Emma had sold 4 of the 9 paintings. She had enough to rent a small cottage outright for 2 years and put money aside for Iris. She kept the remaining 5, not because she was waiting for a better price, though prices were rising, but because she had lived with them long enough that they had become hers in a way that had nothing to do with money. The portrait of the Victorian woman hung above the fireplace in the cottage. Iris, as a toddler, used to point at it and talk to it in the serious one-sided way small children address things they consider important. Emma worked as a bookkeeper for the village grocer from 1966 onward. She was known eventually as someone people came to when they needed something sorted out quietly and without fuss. Nobody who knew her then would have guessed what the first year of her life in that village had looked like. She never spoke badly of the Marsh family. When people asked, she said only that Daniel had been a good man and that she was grateful for what he had left her. She meant the key. She always meant the key. Iris Marsh grew up in that cottage beneath those paintings. She studied art history at Leeds in the early 1980s, a choice that surprised no one who had watched her grow up pointing at the Victorian woman above the fireplace, the last of the 9 paintings sold in 1987 when Iris was 24. The final price was £11,000. Emma was in the cottage kitchen when Iris called to tell her. She said very little. She made a cup of tea and sat for a while looking out at the garden. Later that afternoon she walked across the field to the old chapel. The door had been open for years by then, the lock long since rusted through. She stood in the doorway and looked at the empty corner where the chest had been, and the bare wall where the paintings had leaned in the dark for over 20 years before she found them. Daniel had known what was in there. She was certain of that now. He had known, and he had made sure she would find it, in the only way available to a quiet man who had run out of time. Some things wait a very long time for the right person to open the door. If you liked this story, if there was a moment that stopped you, leave it in the comments below. Was it the key? The chapel? The paintings in the dark? Stories like Emma's don't make the news, but they happen, in locked chapels, in forgotten corners, in the things people leave behind without explanation. New story every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.